Yeah, the first one, obviously, Zimbabwe and how they were not able to defeat Mugabe. They were not able to defeat Mugabe because there was unity in Zimbabwe largely, even though they formed an opposition party, Morgan Tsvangirai party, to try to use that to overthrow Mugabe. But in Zimbabwe, they were not able to overthrow Mugabe. Let's put it this way. Zimbabwe is maybe the most educated country in Africa. Maybe if you take the North Africans out of the equation. They have a cadre of educated Zimbabweans who understood what was happening there. And they were able to support their government to further regime change agenda. I wrote about it. I look broadly before independence or before colonialism and during and after. Any African leader could be traditional leader, a king or president. Any leader the West decided to overthrow them, they were able to overthrow, apart from Mugabe. So it became something quite hard for me to take when Mugabe is overthrown through the actions of his wife. Mugabe was brought low by his wife. Tony Blair and the European Union, the Americans, they all gang up. They were not able to defeat, but Mugabe was defeated by his wife.
What do you mean by that?
In the end, the woman went crazy. She wanted to be president. She did things here that upset the traditional power bloc. So Mugabe was overthrown through that kind of thing. But the wisdom I want to put across. I look at my own country, Ghana. We had our first president, Kwame Nkrumah, who was very good for us. But Nkrumah, when the Americans and the British decided to overthrow him, it took only 2 years. I have studied the Nkrumah phenomenon. The British and the Americans started this coup that overthrew Nkrumah from the 2nd of February 1964, when the then British Prime Minister, Douglas Home, flew to the White House to go and meet President Lyndon Johnson. They teamed up and they decided that Nkrumah must go. 2 years, Nkrumah was gone. Mugabe, they started on him from 2000 all the way to 2017. They couldn't because at the time in Ghana, Nkrumah did not have the intellectual backup that Mugabe had. So that is one wisdom. The second wisdom is the Charles Taylor thing. Charles Taylor hobnobbed with the Americans. And then at some point, he decided to jump out. The Americans decided that, no, we can't let you go. And because of hobnobbing with the Americans, he allowed himself to become vulnerable to American propaganda, American everything. It was easy for the Americans to put him in jail. Africans must learn, if you want to be a puppet, prepare to have your bitter end. My message is that we should stop being puppets of these major powers. We should be ourselves. Africans should be ourselves. We should fight for our common interests. Do what is good for the interests of our people. For our own selfish, short-term interests, you go and lie in bed with the Americans and shot him where power lay, Justila.
Yeah, essentially, if you want to build as people in Africa, is not to necessarily associate yourself or get support from the West or from people who can, in the end, overthrow you in some kind of way or the other.
Yeah, should not be a puppet of these big powers because then you become vulnerable. That's what happened to Charles Taylor.
This is really important, isn't it, Hamid, as an entrepreneur yourself, in terms of where you get your investments, how can you ethically build a business, and how can you maintain your ethos, whether it's being a Pan-African or any kind of values, when you have maybe people who are not aligned. So I think that's really important. I think sometimes when people want to build, they desperately need investment from people with power that don't necessarily have their best interests long-term. Yeah. But how do we do it then? I guess that's the question. Are Black individuals building and helping other Black individuals to thrive? What's going on? What's the gap?
In America, they have more of an understanding of that community of Black individuals helping others to build and providing capital. I'm not so sure about Africa. So Baffour, you can enlighten us around Africa. If we want to build without relying on the people in power, the powers of who that will eventually oppress you, and you want to build with your own people, are you likely to get support from Africans, capital, that type of thing? Because, for example, New Africa, the third eye, is something you want to do. You want it to be the next New Africa, but this time you don't want to rely on funding from Western corporations that can remove their funding if you start saying anything that goes against what they want.
The point I'm making is not to have relations with Western powers. No, the point I'm making is that don't be a puppet. Don't be a puppet against your own people. Yeah, no, because we are in a global village. We need investment from all over the place to be able to do. If you look at East Asia, the targets became targets because of Western investment. We cannot do without Western investment. But the point I'm making is that don't make yourself a puppet for Western investment. If you want to do business, do genuine business. Like over here, we had in Zimbabwe, we had a politician who was called Morgan Tsvangirai.
Okay.
He was the opposition leader who was popped up by the West. They wanted to use him to overthrow Mugabe and rule Zimbabwe and look after Western interests. Morgan Tsvangirai never became president because of being a puppet. If Tsvangirai had made himself or carried himself as an indigenous politician who wants to fight for indigenous interests, he would have become a president. But Tsvangirai made himself such a puppet that it was quite tiring even to report on his activities. That is what Charles Taylor started to do. He allowed the Americans to use him. And then in the end, he wanted to break away from them when he saw that, no, I can't do what the Americans want me to do now. The Americans said, no, if you can't, then we'll push you out of power. And when he had even won democratic elections, they used the UN to impose economic sanctions on Liberia. And Liberia is a country of trees. Liberia has always been in the American orbit since 1847 when it became independent. So when you have sanctions and the Americans put their grip on you, you can't do anything. Charles Taylor made himself too vulnerable.
Okay, the wisdom we've learned is that we can do business with the West, but just don't become a puppet if you want to achieve things. I'm just trying to see what we can take from that and like how we can be better, what knowledge and wisdom we can take from each person's failure and be like, let's not do the same, let's not make the same mistake going forward.
Yes.
With the Mugabe situation, America failed mainly because of the education of the people. I think that was a key point that you mentioned.
Yes, education and the support. So they were able to support the Mugabe and the interests of the nation of Black people. Yeah, that was quite essential.
Who supported the interests of the Black people?
Mugabe was fighting for the interests of Black people. And he had massive support from his people who knew, who were aware, who were conscious of the struggle in Zimbabwe. Okay. If you contrast that with Ghana, Nkrumah was there for 1957. It was Nkrumah who brought mass education to Ghana. So Nkrumah was in power for only 9 years. And many Ghanaians had not risen, had not had education enough for them to be conscious of the struggle that Nkrumah was fighting. So it was easy for the Americans to use the people to overthrow him. They used the police and the army to overthrow him.
Education is important. Do not be a puppet of the West. I think that's easier said than done, obviously, from my perspective, if I look at it, because they have so much power. And then in your situation where you guys were in New Africa, you were trying to support David against Goliath, and all your income was coming from the West. Can we learn from that going forwards? Maybe diversify your income a bit. If you're doing a media, if you know you're going to be fighting against the powers that be, is there a way to diversify your income so that you're not relying on just one source? Maybe that would have helped, do you think?
Yes, that would have helped. But being an African publication, you also rely on some special reports from Africa. But time came when the Africans were not advertising, doing special reports. So even if you wanted to diversify your income, you have the global multinationals that doing business in Africa would want to advertise in the magazine. And you have the African companies and governments that will support you. So if you don't get much from the African side, there is only one source, which is the Western and global advertisers. They gang up against you. You are dead.
Yeah. What about the East? China. I've been seeing lately in the news and just in general, the relationship China is building with multiple African nations, including Zimbabwe, actually. I think I read somewhere that Zimbabwe is a major producer of lithium, which is very important for batteries, cars and everything. And China has now pledged to support the industrial upgrades
Yes.
in lithium. So it seems there is more than one empire or power in the world now. Would it be sensible to say if something like New Africa existed today, or African Stream or something like that, and they were getting money from advertisements from the West, but then they also had money from Africa for some special publications, like you said, and then maybe they had advertisements from China as well coming in. So that way, at least if the African thing dried up and then the West gangs up on you, at least maybe you still have the third opposition, the third avenue of revenue.
Yeah, you're right. But 24 years ago, China was not so dominant in Africa like today.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. I'm not talking about you. I'm just talking about what we can take from what's happened with you and try to be better going forwards. I'm trying to think of how we can be better going forwards.
Today, the Chinese option is there, but during our time, it wasn't so prominent. And I will cite the example of even Zimbabwe Mugabe, when the West ganged up against him and placed economic sanctions on them. He looked east. There was what he called the look east policy. And he was now doing more business with the Chinese, with the Eastern Bloc. And that also helped him to be able to stay the fight against the West. So yes, now, like when you're talking about the lithium, in Zimbabwe, the lithium mining is done by Chinese companies. So today, there is an option to look east.
So how do you feel about China now coming? Because I'm realizing that they're in a lot of places in Africa and it's becoming big. And I don't know, I'm a bit worried because experience has shown me that our African leaders are not the best at striking deals. And it might look like everything is going well now. The Chinese are building roads, they're building infrastructures. But I keep worrying that what are we giving up for this? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it looks like a catch-22 situation here. If you go back to the West, African relationship was only one way. During colonial days, you are only allowed to look up to the mother country. So after independence, African relations were all coming to Europe. But you ask yourself, during that era where there was no China, what did the West actually do for Africa? You are talking about building roads and infrastructure. China is at least building roads and some infrastructure. We can let them eat a bit and we get our roads done, we get our infrastructure done. Our leaders, quite important, should be able to learn how to cut the deals. Yeah, sometimes they are not able to cut these deals even with the Chinese. But half a loaf is better than no bread. I mean, we allowed the Chinese to eat half of the bread. We have half of the bread ourselves.
Yeah,
that is my view about it. Because when we were in New African, we were being urged, kick against the Chinese here, to be reporting like, oh, China is going to take over Africa. We decided that we are not going to go that because we saw how the West had treated Africa over years, and the Chinese are coming. So it's better to have two options. That now there is an East and there's a West.
There's a market. There's a marketplace.
Exactly. Decide which market is ideal for us.
I see. Well, yeah, I think what you said about our leaders knowing how to cut deals is very important because I'm just worried because based on our history with the West and some of the deals that have been cut, like the way we just give things up for like, we might give up access to oil reserves for like 20 years for like 2 million. And that thing is actually worth like, I don't know, billions and billions of dollars. And I'm just like, what the hell? Who made this deal? What leader? What was he thinking? And like, I'm hoping that kind of mentality is still not around, basically, because obviously the Chinese will take advantage of it if it's still floating about.
Yeah.